All right, welcome if you're joining on the recording, and welcome to colleagues who are here with us live. Thank you so much for joining today for the second session of our Beyond the Reading series for the Research with International Students Network. If you're new to RIS, we're a network of scholars whose work generally includes international students as participants or co-researchers within the work that we do. And generally, we take a critical lens towards redeveloping more ethical research and practice with international students. If we haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Jenna Mittelmeier. I'm one of the co-founders of the network and will be leading the session today. If you would like to become more involved with RIS in the future, I'm going to put some links in the chat in just a second, where you can sign up to our mailing lists or follow our LinkedIn page to see what we have coming up next. As I mentioned before, this series is called Beyond the Reading, where each month we're spending a little bit of time in conversation with authors who have produced critical pieces of research within our field to talk to them about the kind of stories and intentions behind the paper. So this is the second conversation we've had, and the first was last month with Andrew Duker. There's a recording link in the chat if you'd like to catch up on what was said before. And after today, we also have two more sessions this year with Ramsey Marabet in November and with Ana Luisa Munoz Garcia in December. So that's the final link that you have in the chat as well to sign up for those upcoming sessions. But today, I'm really pleased to welcome Christina Yao from the University of South Carolina and Chrystal George Mwangi from George Mason University, who are here to discuss their paper written with their co-author Victoria Mullaney Brown, which is entitled Exploring the Intersection of Transnationalism and Critical Race Theory, a Critical Race Analysis of International Student Experiences in the United States. I'm really excited for our conversation today because I think this paper is really pivotal in thinking about race and racialization and how it intersects with the experiences and identities of international students, and as does the work generally that Christina and Chrystal produce within the field. So I'm excited to hear their reflections and their thoughts on this article and this topic. As we go along today, we'll have time at the end for questions, so you can indicate in the chat if you'd like to ask a question out loud, or else you can write out your question for me to read on your behalf, and you can send that to me as a private message as well if you would like to ask a question anonymously. But now to get us started, what I did before the session was I asked both Christina and Chrystal, by way of introduction, to share in advance a photograph that they felt represents them as scholars. So I'm going to show those on the screen now and ask them to introduce themselves. So Christina, I believe yours is up here first. Let me disconnect. There we go. So I will go over to you first.
Yeah, hey everybody, my name's Christina. Really excited to be here with everyone. What you see on the screen is actually a picture of my mom, Agnes Lee. She was Agnes Lee at the time, not married to my dad. This picture was taken, I think actually the night before she came to the United States to study as an international student. So she came here from British colonial Hong Kong. And so my interest in research about international students really came a lot from my experiences growing up and hearing my mom tell stories as an international student in the United States. And this is back in the late 60s, right? Late 60s, early 70s and everything. And what I was struck by was that a lot of the stories I grew up hearing were very similar stories that I was hearing, 2000, right? 2010, all of that and stuff, and that things didn't seem to have changed a lot. But I do love to show this picture because one, it shows my mom as a very young woman about to go to college and really excited and nervous and all of those good things and stuff. But this is really kind of that pivotal moment, I think, that experience of me being engaged in this work and thinking about education, especially higher education, more transnationally and everything. So I will stop there and pass it to Chrystal.
Lovely, thank you. What a beautiful photo as well. I'll hand over to Chrystal now.
Sure. So my photo, in terms of thinking about, who I am as a scholar and research, to me is really kind of focused in on community. And I provided a photo of a group of scholars that we call the FOC group 2014 group, the Faculty of Color Collective. It's a group of scholars, and Christina is actually part of this group as well. We all started our first tenured track jobs together in 2014 at the same time, and over the years have worked together, supported one another in just different kinds of ways, and continue to do so. And so this is a picture of us at last year's Association for the Study of Higher Education ASH conference. And so, you know, when I think about scholarship and, you know, how I come into it, I tend to think about just relationship building, and again, that community piece. So this was something that I wanted to share with you all.
Lovely. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your photos. It's so nice, I think, to see or to hear a story behind the names that we see on the paper. So thank you for that. I'm going to shift our attention to the actual paper that we're going to be discussing today. And I think to start, for those who maybe haven't had a chance to read the article or perhaps want to check their understanding of your intentions within the article, can you give us just a brief summary of what your key arguments are within the paper? I'll direct that perhaps to Chrystal. Sorry, to Christina first.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump in. And by the way, if anybody has difficulty accessing the article, just email me, email Chrystal. We're happy to share it with you as we need to and stuff. But basically, the summary of the article is that many international students who come to the United States would be considered racially minoritized individuals and often are raced or re-raced within the U.S. context. And we know that the U.S. context is heavily influenced by social, historical, contemporary forces. And so when we got together, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit more later on and stuff, but we argue that critical race theory, or CRT, can and should be expanded beyond being solely U.S.-centric, which is really how it was developed and everything, but really be used as a theory for the structures, policies, and practices that are affecting beyond just U.S. domestic students, but rather international students who come to the United States, who are often othered and often racialized and re-racialized within the U.S. constructs of race. And thus, that's why we use CRT as our framing of analysis for interrogating the racism and the racialization that they may experience. So that's, you know, many pages summed up in about a few sentences.
That was a great summary just off the cuffs there. So, I mean, part of what we wanted to do with this series is to get a sense of kind of how articles come to be. So I was wondering, can you put us into the context of when you wrote this article, kind of things like what was happening in your career or what at that time might have contributed to your thinking? So kind of what led you to writing this piece specifically about critical race theory or about racism and nativism in international education more broadly? I'll direct that one to Chrystal.
Sure. So we started this idea a long time ago in 2015. And so Christina and I, career-wise, were both pre-tenure. And then Victoria, who's now Dr. Mulaney Brown, at the time was my PhD student and research assistant. And so, you know, thinking back, Christina and I were at ASH, actually at an ASH conference in 2015. And you know, we started generating the idea. We were seeing different things. So one, at that particular conference, for those who are familiar, it has different kinds of councils. And so there's a council for international higher education. There's a council called the Council for Ethnic Participation that focuses more on like race and racially minoritized folks. And there's other ones as well. And so Christina and I kept just talking about how the International Higher Ed Council and the Council for Ethnic Participation were just so separated. And like, you know, like there was the international higher ed space just was not talking about issues of race and racism at all. And then CEP, the Ethnic Participation Council, was not talking about kind of the global element of higher education at all. And we just felt as scholars, we really sit at the nexus of that work, and that there's so many others who do, and we're thinking about these kinds of things. And so we really saw this focal point of this paper as being a way to kind of connect in and link in the two. And just since this is a behind the scenes to share a little bit more, I had to kind of go back and look. So again, we generated the idea in November of 2015. We started writing it in 2016 and presented it the following year at ASH in 2016. We sent it out for review to a journal in 2017, got accepted into the journal in 2018, and then it wasn't published in a physical issue until 2019. So talking about the length of time it sometimes takes to generate an idea, from idea generation all the way to it showing up, in a journal, can be a long time. But we just felt really committed to this issue, and certainly it had remained relevant, and I think even became more timely as time went on in the process.
I'm seeing a theme here of kind of the value of community and the value of conference spaces in developing your work. Would you say do you see that within the value of your work as well?
Oh, certainly. I mean, people always talk about it's so important at conferences to network and things like that. I'm an introvert, so I tend to hide from people a lot, but it is really important. And again, it's just done from, we were sitting at a table just chatting and, kind of came up with this idea together. So again, just being able to share what you're working on, what your passions are, what, things you're curious about with others. You just never know how it'll kind of continue to push things forward.
I'm inspired because I'm the person who's hiding in the bathroom in the middle of the coffee sessions. So that's really lovely to hear. Well, I guess, in that vein, then what was your experience with writing and co-authorship, especially because it seems like there was a dynamic there where there was your third author who was being supervised by yourself, Chrystal, and maybe some differences in background and experience when coming into this article. So were there any stumbling blocks in the writing or the review process kind of after you submitted the article? Maybe back to Christina for that question.
Yeah, so I think we've all, especially if we as we went through graduate education, we've all been engaged in group work. Group work can sometimes where you find the best synergy and amazing thing happens, right? Sometimes you're in groups and it does not work out very well and you're like, I will never work with this group again. So luckily for me, this was a group with great synergy, and I think we really were able to build on each other's skills and our contributions and everything. And so Victoria, who I identifies as a critical scholar practitioner, really delved deeper into the CRT aspect of it and everything. And I think for both for me and for Chrystal is that really thinking about as a grad student, authorship, contribution, what makes sense, that developmental piece and everything too was really, really important. To me, it was a really fun and insightful process. And like Chrystal mentioned, I mean, I actually remember the table we were sitting at because we were at the conference hotel in the restaurant and we're eating breakfast. We're like, what are we going to do? And I remember we're like taking notes, like, okay, we could do this and this and this and just come up with these ideas, right? And at that time, I'll be honest, like the issues of the overlap between internationalization and race and racism were just not super existent at the time. But at the same time, I think for a lot of us who do work in international higher ed, we've been talking about it a lot, right? We talk about it around in circles and stuff. But what was exciting, I think, for me was that we were finally crafting a narrative that gave us some good talking points, that gave us something that was centered on a theoretical framing, that we hadn't really used in the past, right? That hadn't been used in the past and everything. So, so to me, that was really, really exciting. I would say then in the writing process, no issues. It was a great process. I'll say that the review process, I think Chrystal glossed over one little period of it, but where we actually first submitted this paper to a US journal that would be considered a top tier journal. And the reviewers really hated it. They really hated it. Like they just did not get what we were trying to do. And that's fine. And that happens and everything, right? And so we're like, all right, well, let's just revise it a little bit and then submit it elsewhere. And so that's when we submitted it to Race, Ethnicity, and Education, which we know is based in the UK. David Gilborn, who is a transnational CRT scholar, was and is still, I believe, the editor-in-chief, and so was very supportive, as were the reviewers. I mean, they were really into it. And I think that also, and I'll be honest, I think that speaks a little bit to that sometimes these layers of race, racialization, internationalization, it was a little bit more discussed maybe outside of the US at the time. And then now we're catching up. I think we're talking about a lot more and everything too. But so I think at that time, maybe some US scholars and maybe some US journals weren't really quite ready for this conversation, but I do think it's changed a lot at this process. And I see a lot of differences in the journals, in the manuscripts, things that are coming out now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that experience of rejection. That was a theme that came out of our last webinar, actually, where Andrew was talking about how his paper was rejected from a high impact journal to start with. And it really makes me think about the way these kind of groundbreaking new ideas are probably not going to be well received within the community to start. So that's really valuable, I think, for others to hear that part of your experience as well. Maybe if I jump into actually talking about the content of the paper now. So I think something this paper does really well is kind of highlighting how transnational mobility often means new encounters with kind of differing cultural and historical contexts that impact how race is conceptualized and how racialization occurs. And of course, both of you are writing from kind of the context of the United States. So maybe kind of directing this question to Chrystal this time, what is your sense or your feeling for how racialization impacts international students, and kind of to what extent might that be or not be recognized by their institutions?
Or, I mean, I think, in terms of impact, it can create a lot of dissonance, especially if you're coming from a country where you are the racial majority and it's just not an identity that you think about a lot of the times. And, you're going to a space where not only are you being raced and racialized in your university setting, maybe differently and distinctly, but also potentially experiencing racial oppression and marginalization, right? Alongside that, that can create a lot of dissonance, a lot of confusion, a lot of unsurety around how to navigate those experiences. And, I think for the longest time, institutions in the US context, going back to that context, given the nature of the article, haven't really recognized that for international students. In the US context, for example, federal reporting for international students, does not require international students to indicate a race. So racial identity is kind of almost like silenced or made invisible in that case. And so in terms of support for navigating those kinds of pieces, institutions really weren't kind of capturing or providing that support. It was a lot more around compliance and visa status and things like that. But at the same time, particularly in today's day and age, we have the internet, we have news media and things like that. So international students are not coming to the US without a knowledge of what the racial climate is. It's really more about, you can't escape seeing and hearing about it. It's just wondering, if and how it is going to impact you and how you might handle it. And again, with universities, because of how they're set up, there's a lot of silos in terms of seeing students kind of intersectional identities and being able to provide support around that. And again, around the developmental process, coming in with a particular way in which you think about your racial and racial identity and how that shifts and changes over time too.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point that you raise. And maybe, I mean, this can be directed at either of you, but do you feel there's a kind of hesitancy for higher education institutions or individual researchers even to kind of see international students as potentially racialized individuals? And if so, where might that kind of hesitancy come from?
I can share a little bit. I mean, I think part of it comes from portraying international students one-dimensionally, and this is why I love the research with international students groups so much, is because it really pushes us far further afield beyond that. But again, this kind of one-dimensional portrayal of students as like a visa status, and that's it. And there's this need to really understand one's full embodiment, whether that's race as well, gender, sexuality, religion, whatever, else can be silenced or deprioritized when you're only kind of perceived by your institution in one way. In important ways, certainly, but it can be a really easy way out for institutions to not provide the support around other aspects of who international students are. And then I would say sometimes our understanding of race, racialization, and racism are just too simplistic and bound by national containers. Yes, we know race is a social construct. It is understood within the society that it's grounded within, but we're also a global society, and we should know that, that there's differences in how issues of race and racism are perceived. But for some reason, on a lot of college campuses, we're still really kind of focused in terms of thinking about it in one way and in a way that's solely based within the context of that country. So if we're doing that again and not thinking about race and racism and racial identity as dynamic, if we're just thinking about them as static, or thinking about them in ways that are not transnational or globally present, then again, we're not going to be able to really see our international students around these issues. And that's, just really unacceptable.
Yeah, I mean, you have both spoken about how part of the motivation of this article was that these, two spaces of scholarly thinking, one about race and racialization and the other about internationalization, weren't really speaking to each other. Has that changed? Or is there still a lot of work to do? Whoever wants to answer.
I'll hop in real quick. I think it's changed. I think it's changed. I think in a lot of the scholarship that I see coming out now does address those intersections and the layers, because we have to, right? But what I'll say is also what I hear a lot is from practitioners, so people who are administrators on college campuses, they also recognize that there needs to be a little bit more of that layering. And I think a lot of the question now is, how do we do this? How do we do this work, right? When, especially if we think about institutions of higher education are so siloed, are so separated, we know often that a lot of the responsibility for doing any kind of support or working with international students, it's always the International Students and Scholars Office, right? But where are those linkages with the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office? Where are the linkages with the First Generation Office, right? Where are the linkages with all the other departments and offices where everybody has a responsibility to do that work? So to me, I think that we're seeing it, those connections more, but I think there's still a lot of desire for moving forward.
Yeah, that's a nice kind of segue into the next question I was going to ask. Was, I think something in this article that I also really like is how much you highlight how much of the literature focuses on individual experiences rather than institutional responsibilities. And I think that's something we see kind of broadly across research with international students, where there's a lot of work focusing on international students' experiences and specifically a lot of research about their racialized experiences. But there's a lot less research that's looking at institutions as kind of perpetrators of racial inequalities. So maybe back to Christina again, why do you feel there is this hesitancy to focus on institutional responsibilities and research with international students, and how might that kind of be limiting existing research and practice?
So first, I think a lot of the earlier research about international students that came out was really focused a lot on the individual, right? And I don't fault the prior literature. I don't fault the researchers for doing that, because to me, that's the beauty of social science research, is that we try to understand the human condition and their stories and who they are and what they bring and everything. And we have to know that, right? We have to know that in order to humanize who and what we study, because otherwise, otherwise it becomes just the very static story that, like it's not interesting, right? And so we need to know these individual experiences because it's essential for changing how we do things. Because when we hear stories, that makes a difference in everything. So the fact that there has been a lot of research on the individual and still continues to be research on the individual, I think is really, really important, and we can't lose sight of that. Especially with what Chrystal mentioned, also with the intersectional layers and everything too, is that we need to understand that a little bit more and understand all the stories that are out there. But it is important that we move beyond the individual and think a little bit more about the institutional responsibilities, because what I think for a lot of institutions, and by institutions, I'm talking about higher education, I'm talking about government, I'm talking about, geopolitical forces and all of that, is that it's always easier to blame the individual for the issues, right? So if you're not feeling connected on a college campus, that's your issue and you need to figure that out, right? So it's easier to ask an individual to change rather than changing and fixing a whole system, which in this case is about race and international students. And that would mean that there would be some major overhauls that are needed. We need to change federal policies. We need to change federal policies that are affected by global policies. We have to change immigration policies, institutional structures. We have to change classroom pedagogy. And we all know, for many of us who teach, it's really hard to change classroom pedagogy, and there's a lot of resistance to that and everything. So when we think about all of that, it's really immense about what we have to change, and that's why it's always easier to ask the individual to change and everything. But we know that we have to make these incremental changes of using these critical theories and critical perspective to really highlight and illuminate, that our current policies and practices aren't working, right? And they're not humanizing, and they're not taking into consideration the individuals and everything, especially as it affects our globally mobile students and everything. And so with us, I think in using CRT is that it is a framing that is really more about structures. It's really more about policies, not so much about the individual and everything. Is that this was our start to say, hey, let's take a broader look, and let's just even acknowledge the fact that racism is endemic in the United States. I would actually say racism is endemic around the world, right? But so let's acknowledge that, and then how do we move forward from that and everything, and think about it more from a systems level rather than just the individual level.
Yeah. Do you think this focused specifically on individual level? Do you think that's limited to research with international students, or is that something that's also present kind of in the wider literature that takes a critical race theory lens? So kind of, are there things that research with international students can learn from the literature or advocacy within the critical race theory literature that we're not doing in that area of transnationalism?
I'll pop in real quick, but I think that I think it is changing, right? And I think it's already happening, and I think we do see it, that, well, I'll speak from the US perspective, is that there are federal policies, state policies that are changing, and they're changing because of those individual stories, right? Because the social science research started with that, is that, hey, we've got to look at, well, who the individuals are, what the stories are, and then, yes, this indicates a need to change policies, whether it's, again, institutional, state, federal, beyond, and everything. I also see, a lot of, there's been a lot of emphasis, for example, in the United States about advancing STEM education. And for a long time, it's just been about, like, how do we fix the classroom? How do we do this? How do we prioritize this and stuff? And then now what I see a shift is that there is a little more focus on also the individual stories and everything. Who are our STEM students? How do we break that down? How do we understand what those perspectives are, and understand, how do we become more student-centered? Rather than being institutionally centered and everything. So I think it kind of ebbs and flows, but no matter what, those individual stories are always going to be very, very important.
Yeah. Would you add anything to that, Chrystal?
No, I mean, I think, one of the key things that I continue to see actually echoes what Christina is sharing as well, is that there have been shifts and changes happening, but they're just nuanced. I think CRT just really offers a way to kind of think about both the individual and the lived experience and how important that is, while also paying attention to structures. And sometimes, again, in research, we can really kind of hone in on one and not the other. But when it comes to issues of race and racism, they are both so personally felt as well as structural and embedded. And so it's complicated. And I think, as scholars, we need to kind of continue to work between both of those areas in order to engage in like true transformational kinds of work.
Yeah. I think another thing I wanted to raise was how you highlight in the article kind of a number of ways where whiteness and meritocracy permeate research with international students. So maybe back to Chrystal for this, but where within research do you see that most prominently and most kind of problematically? And maybe with a future orientation in mind, what might research moving away from that lens look like?
Yeah, certainly. So, I'll start a little bit too with the past. Like, I think we have made some progress, right? And progress that doesn't always happen all the time, but, there's been clear critiques around some of the issues around meritocracy, whiteness as property, and thinking about international students solely as like cash cows, like, thinking about the tuition dollars that they may bring in, or thinking of them as helping to, attribute to the institution's diversity, and really like what can international students do for the institution. I think we've started to shift away from that work, or at least that work has received heavy critique, but there's still work to be done. So for example, I think more of the literature is kind of focused in on international student success now, which I think is great, and not, again, just enrolling students, but really like what happens during their experience. But I think still sometimes where meritocracy and whiteness can trickle in, whiteness as property can trickle in, is how are we defining what success is, and how are we working with international students to understand what their motivators are, how they define success at what cost to their mental health and well-being, all of those kinds of things, right? If again, we're just kind of saying, well, this is how we're placing success onto an international student, then again, we're still kind of oftentimes working with like within neoliberal kind of meritocratic ways of thinking, right? Because the institution then is like, well, we need them to be successful so that our numbers look good. It's like, no, we need students to be successful in the ways that work for them, for their well-being, and so that they can leave your institution as whole people still, right? And as people who still feel good. And so really kind of thinking about that, which is, I think, the direction we need to continue to move research in. Again, another reason why I really love this space with research with international students, because it's moving from thinking about research on to research with, and understanding where students themselves are coming from and starting there as a starting point potentially. Also, I think, research has and needs to continue to think about the diverse ways of framing the experiences of international students, as well as the structures that surround those experiences. For this particular article, Christina and I took a chance and kind of thinking outside of the box with the framework, right? The framework that some said, you can't use this to understand international students. That doesn't make any sense. It's like, no, it actually makes a lot of sense, right? So how can we kind of move outside of our binary thinking to say, what are the ways in which frameworks can be applied, can be adapted to understand and kind of ground our work, things that we know are meaningful, even if they haven't been applied before? How can we work transdisciplinarily as well, and pulling from different areas to understand experiences? And again, like CRT does, how can we start from the standpoint of international students to also then build out work, versus sometimes, again, just kind of layering things on to their experiences and to the structures that surround them.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I think your point about the unclear benchmarks is such a problem within our field, that sense of research looking at success without defining what success is. So that I think that's such a great point. Christina, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think no matter what, issues of whiteness as property, meritocracy, it does permeate so much of the research, right? Of everything. I think a lot about even the complications of what does race even mean, right? Like, especially when we think about like with whiteness as property, is that race and being racialized is not always just about what we perceive in I think a lot in the United States is about skin tone, right? Ethnic background, or it's really more about people's perception and how they perceive you, but it's also about language. It's about your accent. It's about your religion. It's about how you practice your religion, caste, class, all of that stuff. And so to a certain extent, there's a lot of complications to this. And I am excited that there's a lot of movement towards discussing those complications, right? And being open about that too.
Yeah.
Can I add one other thing too, just to piggyback off of Christina? Because I think this is some of the pushback that we received sometimes around the application of issues of race and racism to international students' experiences, is again, like, this idea that race is solely phenotype, but race was one of the primary tools that colonizers used to subjugate people and whole nations, right? The idea that these people look differently from us, and therefore this is a way to mark a particular region of the world, not even solely individuals, right? And so again, we have to think about that. Even in racially non-white majority country, oftentimes these countries are being positioned as lesser than majority white countries, and have been historically, right? So racism might not show up at the individual level of being called a name or something like that, but as a whole country or region, it's positioned as lesser than. And so it's just kind of, again, how are we complicating the ways we're thinking about these issues to really kind of get underneath the surface?
Yeah. I think I had one final question to ask both of you before we move to audience questions. So I can see there's a few individual messages to me, but if you've got questions, make sure to indicate in the chat if you want to speak, or you can add your questions for me to read out for you, either in the chat to everyone or as a private message just to me. But my question is, and I'll initially direct that to Christina, is you make this really strong statement at the end of the article about how critical race theory must be connected to action to realize realize its full potential. So I wondered if maybe you'd like to elaborate a little bit on that, especially as it's been a few years now since the article was published, and even more years now since you were initially thinking about these ideas. But thinking about what does that action look like for you within research and practice with international students, and kind of what do you think would represent an ethical approach to researching or conducting practice through a critical race theory lens?
Yeah, I can kick us off and I'll pass it on to Chrystal. Is that, the thing about CRT, when you think about critical race theory, is that it has to be connected to praxis, so critical race praxis. Otherwise, I mean, let's be honest, we're just a bunch of academics and administrators sitting around and talking to each other, and it doesn't go anywhere, right? It doesn't do anything. I think I can say, as far as what I've seen, as far as action in general and everything, I think the Research with International Students group is doing a lot of that action, actively engaging with international students in the research project as collaborators rather than just as research populations. I think that's amazing. And that's really important, especially when I think about international graduate students, that this builds experience in research. And then also, more importantly, let's just be transparent about it, right? It also builds that capital in academia as well. And I think a lot about that as well when I'm working with graduate students that I might be advising, is that I'm like, all right, when we think about how, again, and I think we have different descriptions about success in academia and what that means and everything, but how do I make sure that as an advisor, I'm trying to be considerate of needs, considerate about the support that's needed and everything, but also how do I try to expand opportunities as much as possible, whether it's like with publishing, with research. So again, building that capital to be able to navigate and move through academia and everything. I think also for me is what I'm trying to do more of, and I'll say that I'm also still very guilty of this, is that it's moving towards more disaggregating of data, both qualitative and quantitative, especially when we're talking about international students. We often talk about them as a very monolithic group, and even in this conversation that we've had for the past 40 minutes, we've done that, right? So we're also guilty of doing that and everything. But we all know that international students don't have the same experiences. It changes based on their home country. It changes based on their undergraduate students or graduate students. It's also different for students studying in two-year colleges, right? Students who are studying in four-year institutions, minority serving institutions, things like that. But again, like I mentioned before, is that race and racial categorization is so complicated nowadays, again, because of religion, because of language, because of class, all of those things. And so I think the more that we can tease out some of these nuances and again, acknowledge it, the better we can do this with an extended application of critical race theory, other critical theories that are out there. And I think, when I look at the list of people who are here right now, there's a lot of names that I know and a lot of people who are doing this work already and already changing the field, which is really, really exciting to me, right? Because it gets to a point, I mean, I think, Chrystal, I don't know if you would agree with this, but we talked about it a little bit, is that like it gets to a point, I think we'd be considered kind of like mid-career scholars in this field at this point. And then, at some point you're like, okay, I need to keep thinking and keep evolving my thinking and like what's fresh and new. And to me, what's fresh and new are these newer scholars coming out with like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about that. And it's super exciting to me that a lot of the names and the faces that I see here are the ones who are doing that, right? So to me, the field is moving. The field is becoming really thinking more about like, what's that ethical approach to doing that work and everything. So it's an exciting time to be in this field. And I'll pass it to Chrystal.
I would just to piggyback briefly, I think going back to the photo I shared at the beginning, right? Like that building a community, I think is a really important way to take an ethical approach to CRT work. So I think Christina mentioned some of the other really kind of key pieces, but the work is not easy to do. And I think also in being able to care for oneself and care for others who are engaging in this work, continuing to build community is really important. So, Jen, I know with the RIS space, there's been, a conference last December to kind of get folks together on Zoom and in person. Christina and I years ago started a race and racism subgroup for the Critical Internationalization Studies Network, where we just had people get together and talk about these issues who are scholars and practitioners, et cetera. So, again, how can we continue to work together to support one another in this work, but also hold each other accountable to kind of these ethical considerations, help support one another when we're engaging in really difficult, complicated work. I think that that's really important for also kind of pushing the field further and also engaging in research in a way that kind of moves against this kind of individualistic status quo way of working. That I don't think supports these kinds of efforts.
Yeah, thank you both for your thoughts on that. I'm going to move to questions from the audience, and I've had a few sent directly to me. So I'll start with those, but other colleagues, feel free to put your questions into the chat or indicate if you'd like to speak. But the first one here is about, I wonder about your thoughts about whether critical race theory isn't intersectional enough, in the sense that you've mentioned international students being gendered or treated differently based on religion, for example. Is race too narrow of a focus when it comes to mobility?
I mean, I can share a little bit. So, the thing with critical race theory is race is centered, right? Race is the starting point, and then there's the idea that race, though, is not the sole social identity or way that someone's positioned. That there are all of these additional aspects of a person that provide intersectional points of privilege or oppression. So, the idea around is it intersectional enough? What I would say is, I think it is for what it does, which is center race, and then consider all of the other things. But if one is trying to center another social identity and then kind of again bring in an intersectional lens, there might be other starting points for you to think about. Or if you're thinking about kind of again truly an intersectional understanding, then intersectionality in itself can serve as a frame and framework, right? So I think it depends on what lens you're trying to bring. I don't think that CRT is not intersectional enough if you're really trying to understand race and racialization in terms of mobility. But if you're thinking, I want to understand mobility through an intersectional lens, it offers something to you, but it's still going to always bring you back to race, right? And so again, that's what a framework or theory does. It's going to give you some ways to kind of zone in, because there's just so much to think about in research.
Yeah.
I'll just say ditto. And the only thing, other thing that I'll add is that, as a researcher, it's all about making decisions, right? So as a researcher, you're making a decision about maybe what population you're studying, what your topic is, and you also make decisions on your theoretical or conceptual framing. And so for this particular paper, our decision was using CRT and using lens as our starting point of examining, the student population, all of that and everything too. So yeah, so is it everything that Chrystal said, I agree with 100%. So it's about making decisions about what makes sense as far as your framing.
Mm. There's another similar question. It says, in the conclusion, you discuss exploring intersections using critical queer theory. How do you define that, and how would you explain that to others, as it's an avenue they're interested in exploring in their dissertation?
I'll pop in a little bit with this. I'll be honest, y'all, sometimes y'all ask questions about things in the paper and I'm like, dang it, we wrote that in 2016. I got to look at it again. So this is what happens sometimes, but I love it because it makes me think again, like, what did we say and why did we say that? So I think we mentioned critical queer theory just as an example, right? Again, using that whether it's an intersectional analysis or is it an analysis about queerness, right, and queer identity? Is it a queer studies type of a topic and everything? So again, I think going back to the previous question also is that this could be a possibility, right? I don't know if I've seen a lot, and this could be my ignorance with it. I don't know if I've seen a lot of studies specifically on queer studies, queer identity, critical queerness related to international students, particularly in the United States and everything. So, but I think that's a great area to go into. I would love to read about it. I'd love to cite it. I'd love to assign it in my classes and stuff too. So I'll pass it to Chrystal. So maybe you're more familiar.
I saw Martin Rosales. I'm just gonna shut you out because I saw you pointing to yourself and like me.
That's me. That's my question. And before you answer, the reason why I'm asking this question is I brought this up to my chair and they were like, what is that? You can't just call something critical. And I'm like, that's a good point. So how do I explain why this is the frame? So basically everything that Christina just said is like, yep, my dissertation to a T. So I'm calling myself out. Hi, recording friends. So please continue.
Yeah, no problem. And when thinking about that theory in particular, it's again thinking about the ways that power and privilege exist within gender and sexuality, right? And kind of challenging traditional assumptions around gender and sexuality as well. So again, it's going to also be intersectional in some way, but it's going to kind of start from gender and sexuality. critical feminism, which is also talked about in the paper, is going to start from gender. So, and kind of build outwards. So it's just kind of thinking about, what are other ways? The critical kinds of, whether it's critical race theory has multiple kinds of cousins. So there's Asian crit, and there's Black crit. There's Lat crit. So there's all kinds. And then there's also lots of other kinds of critical theories that don't come out of CRT in particular as well. So again, if you're thinking about a critical epistemology, a critical worldview, then you're always kind of thinking about issues of equity, power, oppression, marginalization, how those things are layered in to the ways in which we understand questions and our curiosities as scholars and as practitioners as well.
Yeah, I mean, it links to another question in the chat, which is about, were there any thoughts that appeared in your research on intersectionalities like accent diversity or neurodiversity?
There's also discrit, which goes back to the ways so again, kind of foregrounding ability, neurodiversity from a critical standpoint. So that might be another additional starting point for the person who asked that question. So I just wanted to share that.
I'll also add in that I have some students who, based on a class that I taught, I mean, this was like 3-4 years ago, and we're at a point where any day now we should be hearing back from the journal with an accept, I hope, is the goal. But it was really about the critical discourse analysis of accent reduction programs in the United States. Right? Accent reduction programs are basically programs where typically individuals who may be perceived as having an accent in the United States might sign up to help reduce the accent. So, for a variety of reasons and everything like that. And so when we talk about with like the accent diversity and everything, is that what we looked a little bit more into is the studies on racial linguistics in the United States. And so I think that might be a great way to look at. So the thing is, what we want to think about is, especially with global research, international research and stuff, is that there are so many big bodies of studies out there that can help inform some of the work that we do, right? So even I think about like with Martin, when you think about like with queer studies, is that a lot of when you think about queerness is that it's anything that deviates from what's considered the norm, right? So like, what does that mean and how do you do that? And so I think no matter what, these topics are exciting to me. And I think, again, remember, right, especially for those of you who are students, if this is your interest and this is what you want to do, you just need to really make a case to your advisor, your chair, your committee, like this, I read into this, I've delved really deeply into this, and this is why this work is important, right? And be able to just justify the decisions that you make. And usually as faculty, we're like, okay, I can buy it. All right, I'll follow that and stuff too. So some good stuff out there.
So the next question that's been sent to me is asking about the politicization of CRT. So they've said, I've seen a lot of talk about critical race theory in the United States and how it's been politicized or even banned in schools. How do you think this is impacting higher education? And do you think it will make research from this perspective less recognized or accepted by universities or practitioners? Bit of a loaded question.
Yeah, I'll pop in first. I mean, I have no qualms in speaking my truths and beliefs about CRT and policies and all of that stuff related to it, right? People are like, oh, be careful what you say and you send your emails. They can like request your records. I'm like, you're going to be really bored by my emails. It's going to be like, did you do this? Did I do that? And all that. But there is a lot of discourse about CRT, right? And there's actually a lot of incorrect discourse about CRT. I know that I'm in the state of South Carolina, and for a while, the state legislature was trying to shut down anything related to critical race theory, anything related to CRT. But nobody really knew what CRT was. Like if I asked them, like, what is CRT? Nobody can really describe it and stuff, right? But no matter what, whether they know what CRT is or not, there's still some very real outcomes from that, right? Of saying we're going to block anything related to DEI. We're not going to do anything related to equity. We're going to get rid of funding and all that stuff. I'll speak for myself. As somebody who has been doing this work for many years, as somebody who was doing this work even pre-tenure and stuff, right, is that I believe very strongly in it. I think it's important, and I'm not going to stop doing it. And so, but at the same time, right, I think there always has to be some considerations about your own personal safety, about your ability to keep your job, doing all that stuff. So, I don't fault anybody for making whatever decisions they may need to based on their research and all of that. I'll also say, again, speaking for myself, is that although I would identify myself as more like an equity scholar, I do work on race, all of that, I think when I'm presented out publicly, people see me more as of an international higher ed scholar, and they never think that that has much to do with race, racism, intersectionality, things like that from that critical perspective. And so to a certain extent, I can kind of float under the radar a little bit more, I think. And that's fine, right? And I'm like, all right, that's fine. But I'll still continue to do that work and still engage in it. And most importantly to me is also supporting students who want to do this work, right, and back them up and everything. So, all right, I'll pass it to Chrystal to answer this loaded question.
No, I was just going to say, so I would echo what you shared. And I think for those, I think, I see some things mentioned in the chat. I mean, what's happening is it's just creating a chilling effect, right? It's making a lot of folks scared to use these theories to do work related to, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, or to have those in titles. And what critical race theory would actually say is all of this kind of like culture war kind of stuff happening around DEI and CRT is exactly what a white supremacist structure is trying to do. It's trying to force institutions, people to waste all of this time hiding things and changing names and, doing all of this stuff instead of doing the actual work to improve racial equity. And so, that's really the unfortunate thing about all of this, is not that it's just wrong in and of itself, because it is. And most folks who are sharing that they're anti this stuff don't know a lot about it, unfortunately. But the real challenge around it is that it's impacting work being done. It's, you change the name of an office and now a student is like, well, where do I go for support? Because I don't know, it doesn't, so it creates these chilling effects that are more long-standing. But I think in your scholarship, and as practitioners too, it's being well read and well versed, because you don't have to use CRT, but there's a million tenets under CRT. There are lots of there are actually a lot of aspects around CRT that aren't even they don't tend to even be mentioned in higher education literature. So like there's a concept called education work, even though it has the word education in it, we don't tend to talk about that tenet of CRT a lot in higher ed. So there's so many other theories and frameworks that are really connective to CRT that wouldn't require you to use the word CRT. So again, if you're well read, it's like no matter what words people take away, there are other words, there are other concepts out there, there are other authors that you can draw and cite from, but you have to know that work. And so it's unfortunate too that we have to do that extra work. Right. I mean, that's again part of the chilling effect. But there are other ways to frame that still get at the same thing, so that you can keep doing the work if for some reason it's prohibitive to use a CRT framework in your context right now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that and speaking candidly on this issue. There's some other comments in the chat about this if colleagues want to continue that conversation or share tips and strategies. The next question, though, that was brought to my attention. So they are saying, appreciate the fundamental question about what does race even mean, and that they think we use that word without thinking of the deeper implications sometimes. When we engage in this research, what does race mean from the perspective of the researcher versus what it means from the students who they may be studying in a new context for race? For example, students who are racialized as Black in the context where they study might not identify that way. So their questions are about how do we include race and avoid data siloing while also making sure not to re-racialize? What does it look like giving international students agency in how they are seen, including dialogues of race without imposing it?
I can share a little bit. I mean, so I think it goes back to this idea that racial identity is not static, it's dynamic, it develops. So again, in my own research, so for some of you may know, but back in 2014, I developed a framework called the Learning Race in the US Context Framework that talked about the experiences of international students. Most in the study were racially Black, who were navigating their racial identity development in the US. And many of the students kind of talked about coming to the US with a particular understanding of their racial identity and coming out of it with a different understanding, many of the times because of what was placed on them, what they were experiencing. And again, I think institutions see race as like a variable, and it's like, just check the box. But it's so much more than that, right? And again, it can shift. One might say, might say other when they start, And like by the time you end it, you might decide to check off Black. Who knows? And like our institutions even paying attention to those things, like the shifts and like why that's happening, right? So it's again the idea of thinking about race beyond the variable, being able to support students where they are, understanding that students rightfully so, may come to the US or any particular context saying, I don't want to deal with this. Like, I just want to get my degree. That's it. I don't want to deal with this. And then over time, sometimes recognize there's no way to not deal with it because of the things happening. And at that, they might not be ready at one point, but they might need support later. So if you're not continually providing support and understanding the positioning of students and their lived experiences and working from what they need at different points in their experience, then it's always going to be problematic in terms of this issue. But yeah, it's moving away from the placement of, as this person said, of something on someone to really understanding where are they and how is that development continuing to happen and being there at every step of the way to ensure that they have what they need to, again, move through as a whole and well person. And we're not doing that really yet.
And I also add from like a research perspective, right, is that I think as researchers, again, whether you're qualitative, you're quantitative, anything like that, is like we like categories. Let's just put that out there. We like categories. That's how our minds work. And I think especially as you go further along, you know, whether as a doctoral student, all of that, like categories help us make sense of the world, right? So it's hard to kind of shift out of that mindset and everything. The thing is that, you know, when I'm doing research with international students, I think it's so important to try to ask questions as much as possible, is to also let participants, or they're choosing to serve as participants, to self-identify. Right. So when we do research and we're asking about gender identity, we're asking about, you know, what do you call home? It's always where it's like, it might be a form, and it might be where it's always where students can fill that out, right? Put text in there. Because again, I'm not going to try to make you do a checkbox, right? That you're Black, white, whatever, and stuff like that, that you're male or female, you know, any of that and stuff, right? My thing is that you write in what your gender identity is. You write in, you know, where you find home. And also, and I think another piece is also giving participants the opportunity to even choose their own pseudonyms. I think we often, like, I'll speak as somebody who was born and raised in the United States, is that often we're like, oh, we need a pseudonym. I'm like, okay, Bob. Who's Bob? I don't even know a Bob, right? Like, but also that's not very culturally responsive too, right? And so making sure that as much as possible in the work that we do, that we're taking some of these into consideration and allowing for our participants to really think about and self-identify as much as possible too.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. I'm really conscious of time, and I know there's a few questions in the chat that I didn't get to, but I'm sure that both Christina and Chrystal will be happy to receive maybe an email afterwards to continue this chat. But I think what I'll do is kind of wrap up our session for today and just say thank you so very much to Chrystal and Christina for this really fascinating discussion and insight into their work. So join me in a virtual round of applause, please, and say thank you for coming here today. I'll just invite in that our next Beyond the Reading session takes place on November 5th at 3:00 p.m. UK time, where we've got Ramsey Marabet here, who will be discussing his paper called Students We Label International, an Urgent Call to Reconceptualize Research with International Students. And I'll just add a link into the chat if you'd like to sign up to join us for that session as well. But we'll end here. Thank you again so much for joining, and thank you to Chrystal and Christina for your thoughts today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jenna, for coordinating this. This was great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.